Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are wading into some of the most intense and, frankly, uncomfortable source material we have ever synthesized.
Yeah, this is a heavy one.
We've been handed a stack of documents, specifically Stephen Work's Multiverse journal series and John Carter's Homo Umbrans essays, that make a truly staggering claim.
And that claim is this. The deep societal challenges we face are not just a collection of random problems. Not at all.
Yeah.
Instead, they're the result of a cohesive foundational system of coordinated harm and profit.
And so our mission today is to synthesize two critiques that seem, on the surface, completely separate.
Right. The first is the spiritual and cognitive annihilation of the modern citizen, what Carter calls the rise of Homo Umbrans, the shadow man.
And the second is the systematic economic and political disempowerment of that same citizen, which Work documents using, verifiable public data.
So we're not looking at an accidental decline here. The sources are arguing that we are simultaneously undergoing a cognitive collapse and a systematic economic betrayal.
And that these two things are intimately connected.
Exactly. The core argument is that an initial state-mandated moral inversion, a forced lie, created the perfect environment for a kind of linguistic virus to thrive.
And at the same time, a parallel system of political and economic extraction was quietly put into place.
Right, against a population that was now vulnerable, that was now compromised.
It's a compelling, if deeply dark, thesis.
It is. The sources suggest that the integrity of the individual's internal state, their mind, their soul, had to be compromised first.
And that created a citizenry that was unable to even identify, let alone resist, the exploitation when it arrived in full force.
So we are going to walk through this synthesis impartially. We're focusing on the specific factual claims and the internal logic presented by the authors to help you understand why they draw these radical conclusions.
Okay, so let's unpack this complex picture, starting with the terminal diagnosis, the annihilation of the soul and the rise of the shadow man.
Let's do it.
So, part one. When John Carter writes in his essays about Homo Umbrans, he's not just using a metaphor. He's not engaging in hyperbole.
No, not at all. He is presenting what he sees as a clinical diagnosis of cognitive decay. He's arguing for a fundamental degradation of human consciousness itself.
And he calls it Homo Umbrans, the shadow man.
Carter's defining this shadow man as an individual who has lost the essential qualities of true sapience. So, moving away from Homo sapiens.
And what's lost specifically?
What's lost, fundamentally, are two things: abstract reason and self-awareness, or what academics would call metacognition.
Let's pause on that word for a moment, because it's critical to this whole argument. What is metacognition in this context?
It's thinking about your own thinking. I mean, it's that simple. It's the internal ability to step back, to recognize a contradiction in your own beliefs, and then try to reconcile your past beliefs with your present actions.
Or just separating fact from emotion.
Exactly. And without that, the individual becomes what Carter describes an unreflective automaton, a non-player character, or an NPC, from video games.
Just running on scripts.
Running purely on pre-programmed scripts dictated by the surrounding ideological environment. They respond to stimuli, but they don't reflect. There's no inner check.
So if metacognition is like the inner light of consciousness, the sources claim that the primary mechanism used to extinguish it is linguistic corruption, the destruction of language.
Yes.
Why is language so potent a weapon?
Carter posits that coherent thought is literally impossible without stable language. Language provides the architecture, the very framework for abstract reason.
The building blocks of thought.
The building blocks. So if you systematically corrupt the definition and meaning of essential words, if up can mean down, if the terms of debate are constantly shifting or inverted, you make metacognition impossible.
And by doing that, you extinguish that inner light.
You do. The destruction of language is, therefore, the primary weapon for cognitive collapse, according to Carter.
And the sources provide some extensive and honestly chilling examples of this systematic inversion. They argue it's not just, language evolving.
No, this is deliberate. They claim it's a high-level operation to render rational discourse meaningless by turning concepts completely inside out.
So where do we start? Morality.
You can start with morality. The sources note how hate is systematically redefined. It no longer means ill will toward another person.
Right.
Now, it means love of one's own. So if you prioritize your family, your community, your nation, or your traditions, that is instantly categorized and policed as hate speech.
And the flip side of that is social justice.
Which is inverted to mean antisocial injustice. Because, the sources argue, the pursuit of group-based outcomes requires active discrimination and the violation of universal standards to achieve its goals. You have to be unjust to individuals to achieve the just group outcome.
And maybe the most destructive inversion relates to communication itself.
Oh, absolutely. Speech becomes violence. The idea is that words can cause psychological harm, and so that justifies censorship. It justifies shutting people down.
But then if people resort to actual physical action,
Then violence is immediately redefined as speech. It becomes a legitimate, even necessary, form of political expression or protest against perceived oppression.
it's a perfect trap. There's no way out.
It's a complete inversion. And this leads to the most pervasive one of all, tolerance.
Which used to just mean putting up with people you disagree with.
Exactly. Forbearing,
Hmm.
allowing people to coexist peacefully. That has now morphed entirely into forced celebration.
So it's not enough to just leave people alone.
Not at all. If you fail to actively affirm and enthusiastically celebrate a behavior or belief, you are deemed intolerant, bigoted, and worthy of social exclusion.
Which eliminates the very possibility of private dissent. It forces outward conformity.
And that further annihilates any kind of internal coherence. You have to say things you don't believe to survive.
To bring this abstract concept of the shadow man to life, Carter uses a very specific, unforgettable anecdote. He calls it the human water fountain.
Yeah, this one is something else. This was an Australian mental health worker who publicly declared and celebrated the potential violent death of a political opponent.
A mental health work.
A professional dedicated to mental wellness, advocating for literal violence against a man she disliked. But here's the critical part, the part that reveals the condition.
Go on.
When she faced professional consequences for her extreme statement, she immediately appealed to the very free speech norms that her ideological group had spent years arguing were dangerous, toxic, and should be dismantled.
So she needed the rules of the game to defend herself, even though she had dedicated her public life to tearing those same rules down for everybody else.
Exactly. The sources argue this perfectly captures the Homo umbrans condition. She possessed no memory of her own actions, no self-awareness. She demonstrated a complete inability to connect her past, her ideological war on free speech, with her present predicament, where she suddenly needed free speech for her own protection.
She was just operating on a script.
Purely on a script. When the script switched from attack the enemy to defend myself, she lacked the metacognitive capacity to register the profound, dangerous contradiction. She was, in the source's view, truly an automaton, a void of self-awareness.
Okay, so this linguistic virus is the mechanism of decay. But Stephen Work, in his journals, he asks a deeper question. Why was society so vulnerable to it in the first place?
Right. I mean, a virus needs a weakened host.
And he argues that the vulnerability stemmed from a deeper, pre-existing societal wound that weakened our collective cognitive immune system.
And Work identifies a very specific moment. He points to the legalization and societal normalization of abortion, particularly post-Roe v. Wade in 1973, as the catalyst for a profound societal fall into what he calls insanity acceptance.
This is a very specific, very strong argument. Work frames this event not merely as a policy decision.
No, he sees it as a primary spiritual event, one that fractured the entire societal psyche.
He uses incredibly strong language here. We should be clear, this is Work's precise thesis. He's framing it as a moment where the state itself became an agent of moral and cognitive corruption.
That's right. He treats it as a theological and moral catastrophe. He explicitly refers to the state's action as a public announcement that Satan rules the federal government.
That's quite a statement.
It is. But the power of his claim rests on the fact that this was a government-mandated acceptance. By legally sanctioning the termination of developing human life, the state, according to Work, forced a moral compromise upon the entire nation. It initiated a collective foundational lie where society was compelled to accept a falsehood as truth.
And Work, he doesn't just leave this as a spiritual claim. He grounds it in a fascinating synthesis, connecting the 13th century philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas with modern psychology.
Yeah, this part is really interesting. He bridges that gap.
So how does he do it?
Aquinas argued that repeated habituation to vice, the intentional rejection of a known good, such as the vice work assigns to abortion, inflicts specific wounds upon our fundamental human faculties.
What kind of wounds?
Wounds to the intellect, to memory, to our judgment, to our charity. And Work links this philosophical damage directly to modern, measurable psychological distress.
So he's saying there are real-world consequences.
Yes, The sources cite modern studies that correlate this kind of moral habituation with severe psychological and cognitive consequences. Studies show increased risks of depression, anxiety, grief, guilt, lower self-esteem, and other long-term mental health disorders among those involved.
So Work argues that this isn't just an emotional toll, it's actual cognitive damage.
That's his point. By normalizing an action that he argues fundamentally contradicts the biological and moral reality of human life, the society's capacity for rational judgment is undermined at its very root.
Okay, and this brings us to the crucial synthesis point. Work is arguing that this foundational moral lie was the training ground, the boot camp for the cognitive decay Carter describes later.
Absolutely. By compelling society to assent to the foundational falsehood that the intentional termination of a developing human life is morally neutral and politically protected, the state habituated the population to the very act of self-deception.
It weakens society's cognitive immune system.
Perfectly put. So if the population was trained in 1973 to ignore biological reality and redefine life as a clump of cells or just a choice,
Then they were already preconditioned, say, 20 years later, to accept that a man can be a woman, or that facts are secondary to feelings, or that speech equals violence.
the first large-scale state-sanctioned lie made all the subsequent linguistic distortions dramatically easier to swallow. The path to homo umbrans, in this view, began with the state-sanctioned inversion of life and death.
It's the required starting point in the source's narrative. Compromise the inner moral and intellectual state first, and the systemic extraction becomes, well, inevitable.
And that sets the stage perfectly for the second part of this synthesis.
Right. The systematic suppression of empirical reality. If the citizen's mind has already been compromised, as we just discussed, it makes sense that the sources would then claim we've been prepared to accept the suppression of inconvenient facts, especially facts about deep-seated social disparities.
We have to start with the reigning narrative, the story that's told in modern political and academic discourse.
The official story.
The official story. And the core premise is that poverty and socioeconomic disparities, particularly between racial and ethnic groups, are caused primarily or even entirely by persistent racism and systemic discrimination.
The logic being, if outcomes are unequal, and if we assume all groups have equal innate capabilities, then the cause must be external oppression. It's the only variable left.
Right. And this premise, as the sources claim, justifies massive political power structures, huge wealth transfer schemes, and the existence of entire academic disciplines.
But the sources introduce what they call the forbidden empirical reality, one that's meticulously documented in the field of psychometrics.
And that reality is this. Poverty correlates strongly with IQ across all racial groups, and average IQ differences between populations explain the majority of outcome disparities, income, education, criminality, health, all of it.
And this data is considered taboo.
Absolutely taboo.
Yeah.
Because it directly, and I mean directly, contradicts the dominant narrative.
Let's dive into the specifics of that psychometric reality. The sources draw heavily on the findings detailed in a book called The Bell Curve, and they maintain these findings were, and still largely are, scientifically non-controversial within the field of psychometrics itself.
Right. The controversy is external to the science. So there are three main points the sources emphasize. First, IQ, or general cognitive ability, is measurable, it's stable across your lifespan, and it functions as the single best statistical predictor of job performance and life outcomes that we have, period.
Better than anything else.
Better than anything else. Second, IQ is substantially heritable. We're talking between 50 and 80% in adults. This means, like height or temperament, a large portion of the variance is genetically influenced, which makes it very resistant to rapid environmental change.
And then there's the third most explosive point.
Average differences exist between populations. The sources cite data showing an approximate 15-point average gap between Black and white Americans, with East Asian Americans and Ashkenazi Jews scoring, on average, higher than white Americans.
And here's the crucial policy implication the sources stress. These differences persist even when you control for socioeconomic status.
And critically, they are resistant to expensive, large-scale environmental interventions. The sources point to massive longitudinal programs like Head Start,
Which cost billions.
billions and billions, and they failed to produce lasting IQ gains or close the achievement gap. This bolsters the claim that the differences are deeply rooted and not purely or even mostly environmental.
So, if poverty correlates with lower IQ across all races, meaning poor white people, poor Black people, and poor Hispanic people, all tend to have lower cognitive resources than their richer counterparts.
The core thesis that racism causes poverty is, according to the sources, empirically false.
Which would make the entire grievance industry a parasitic structure built on a lie.
That is precisely their claim.
So given that the data is robust, why is discussing it or even just reporting on it treated as an unforgivable moral transgression? The sources detail what they call a systematic suppression machine.
And it's not just disagreement, it's character assassination, it's professional destruction. The sources describe a multi-pronged suppression effort. In academia, for example, researchers who publish this data often lose their positions. Their careers are derailed.
They cite some big names.
They do. James Watson, the co-discoverer of DNA structure, was stripped of his honors. Charles Murray, the co-author of The Bell Curve, faces institutional violence. He's shouted down at universities. He's not refuted with data. He's violently silenced.
And it goes beyond just individuals. Funding is denied for research that's labeled controversial.
And papers are rejected on ideological grounds, not for methodological flaws. This creates a powerful self-censorship mechanism. You learn very quickly what you are and are not allowed to study.
The media acts as the enforcement arm of this.
Absolutely. Journalists who report these findings are immediately labeled as racists. The science itself is reframed, again, not challenged scientifically, but denounced as pseudoscience.
The overall chilling effect is what matters.
That's the goal. Everyone who knows the truth remains silent, perpetuating the lie through calculated self-preservation.
Okay, so why? Why are these massive power structures so invested in maintaining what the sources claim is a demonstrably false narrative? Who profits from the lie?
The profit motives are, staggering. The sources point first and foremost to the DA grievance industry.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
That ecosystem includes consultants, diversity officers, nonprofits, entire academic departments. And it earns billions and millions annually.
And their entire existence depends on the problem never being solved.
Exactly. If the scientific reality were accepted, that outcome disparities are largely due to cognitive variation, not systemic racism, this entire multi-billion-dollar industry would instantly become obsolete. They have a direct financial incentive to maintain the narrative of perpetual systemic oppression.
And politically, it justifies an endless expansion of government power.
Absolutely. It provides permanent justification for expanded bureaucratic control. It's a career builder for politicians who promise to fight racism and redistribute wealth based on group identity rather than actual need or capability.
The structure is perverse.
It is. Those in power are incentivized to resist actual improvements because solving the problems would eliminate their own necessity and their funding streams.
Furthermore, the sources argue that this narrative causes profound psychological harm to the very groups it claims to protect. How does that damage manifest?
The primary harm is the cultivation of learned helplessness.
Okay, what does that mean?
By constantly externalizing failure to systemic racism, the narrative removes an individual's internal locus of control. The person starts to think, my failure isn't my fault, it's due to these oppressive external forces. It's not about my effort or my choices.
So it discourages self-improvement, effort, honest self-assessment.
And it generates rage at phantom enemies, which, if you recall, is a key characteristic of Carter's shadow man condition.
And that ties right into the concept of lowered standards, what some have called the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Yes. The drive for equity, which means equal outcomes regardless of input, leads to policies like affirmative action that create severe mismatch problems.
So you're placing people in environments they're not prepared for.
Exactly.
Okay.
When individuals are placed into academic or professional environments where their cognitive capacity is mismatched with the required rigor, it leads to higher dropout rates, failure, and worse outcomes than if they had attended institutions that were a better fit.
So the denial of reality, driven by this narrative, actively harms the very people it's supposed to help.
That's the argument. So, you have the cognitive decay of the citizen from part one, which is then reinforced by a system that actively suppresses measurable reality in part two, all to maintain massive financial and political profit. And the result is a psychologically crippled, rage-filled population.
Ready for the next level of extraction.
Exactly. Which brings us to the money.
Part 3. If the intellectual and moral foundations of the citizen have been compromised and objective reality is suppressed for profit, then what about their wallet? We now move to the hard data on what the sources claim is the coordinated, systematic economic theft of the American citizen. And this is between 1979 and the present.
This is where the synthesis shifts to hard economics. We're using public data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, and the Federal Reserve Economic Data, or
Sure, so
FR.
this is all out in the open.
It's all public. And the sources present what they see as overwhelming evidence of a deliberate economic transformation, not a natural market cycle, that resulted in a massive appropriation of labor-generated value by the owners of capital. This is the wage productivity gap.
Let's detail the exact disparity that forms the core of their claim of theft.
Okay. Between 1979 and 2024, worker productivity increased by an astonishing 80.9%.
So the average worker is producing 80% more value than they were in 1979.
For the same input of time, yes. Yet, median hourly wages only rose 29.4% during that same period.
The numbers are staggering. Had wages simply tracked productivity, what would the median hourly wage be today?
According to the source's calculation, the median hourly wage in 2024 should be $39.80, adjusted for simple CPI.
And what is it actually?
It's approximately $19.33.
So that difference, a gap of over $20 per hour, that's the systematic appropriation of labor value.
That's what they call the theft. When you extrapolate that, this gap equates to roughly $3,500 to $4,000 per worker per month in stolen productivity gains alone.
Per month.
Per worker, per month.
And the sources argue that this calculation actually understates the true theft.
It does, because it relies on the official inflation numbers, the CPI. And we need to talk about what they call the inflation deception. Official CPI inflation over that period was plus 188%.
How is that number manipulated?
The sources claim the CPI was systematically defanged by bureaucratic policy changes, starting in the 1980s and 1990s. And there are two primary mechanisms they point to: hedonic adjustments and substitution bias.
Okay, let's explain this clearly. What's a hedonic adjustment?
A hedonic adjustment assumes that if a product has new features, say a laptop is faster this year than it was last year, then the price increase isn't really inflation. It's an increase in value. So the government discounts the price increase from the inflation calculation.
I see. And what about substitution bias?
The substitution bias assumes that if the price of beef goes up, consumers will simply switch to cheaper chicken, and therefore the inflation impact on their life is mitigated.
So this effectively makes the basket of goods used to measure inflation a constantly degraded reflection of what working-class people actually have to buy.
It's a fantasy basket. The average worker doesn't feel 188% inflation. They feel the real costs of the essentials they can't substitute.
Like what?
Exactly. The sources note that the real costs for non-substitutable essentials, housing, fuel, healthcare, and education, increased between 300 and 500% over the same period. This systematic underreporting masks a catastrophic decline in the purchasing power of that $19.33 wage.
So when you factor in that real cost inflation, what is the total value appropriated?
The sources estimate it's not $3,500, but between $4,500 and $6,000 per worker per month.
Wow.
And they explicitly suggest that this data justifies a universal dividend income, a UDI, of $4,500 to $5,000 monthly per adult, simply as a restoration of stolen wages and purchasing power.
So it's not viewed as welfare, it's restitution.
It's viewed as restitution for what they call the largest act of coordinated theft in economic history. And if you look at where the wealth went, it's not just the wage gap. You have to look at the tax burden shift.
Okay, detail that dramatic transfer from capital to labor.
In 1979, corporate tax contributed roughly 40% of federal revenue. Individual income tax contributed about 50%. It was a relatively balanced system where capital paid a significant share for national maintenance.
And today?
By 2024, corporate tax had plummeted to around 7%, while the individual tax burden had soared to about 88%.
That is a tectonic shift.
It is. The sources argue this creates a profound injustice. Citizens, through their individual income taxes, fund public infrastructure, fundamental research, things like GPS, the internet, basic scientific breakthroughs.
Things corporations use to make money.
Exactly. Corporations then use this publicly funded infrastructure for private profit, pay a tiny fraction of the taxes, and then charge the citizens who funded the innovation in the first place to access the services derived from it.
So they get all the profit while the citizen shoulders the cost and the risk.
That's the model.
This massive economic theft, it must be protected politically. And the sources point to the hyper-empowerment of corporations, particularly since the Citizens United Supreme Court decision in 2010.
Right, which treated corporations as fictional persons with unlimited political speech rights.
The data on corporate political influence is just overwhelming.
It is. Corporate political expenditures routinely eclipse individual contributions by factors of 20 to 30. Annual lobbying expenditures hover near $4 billion. The sheer scale of corporate resources means that the political landscape is radically, fundamentally skewed.
And the sources make a really powerful point about the scale of this power. They argue that corporations now function as entities that are larger and more powerful than many sovereign states.
Consider the revenue data they cite. The profits of just the top 3 U.S. corporations, think Apple, Microsoft, ExxonMobil, surpass the gross domestic product of over 140 UN member nations.
So if, as the Supreme Court ruled, money is speech,
Then these corporations wield political, economic, and social power far exceeding that of entire countries.
and this creates a deep and dangerous inversion. Fictional corporate persons have unlimited political speech and protected rights.
While real, flesh-and-blood citizens are routinely facing blacklisting, employment termination, and platform bans for speech that is deemed inconvenient or offensive to corporate power.
So the citizen bears all the political risk and social obligation, while the corporation enjoys the rights without the responsibility.
Precisely. And this political inversion is reflected in budget priorities. The sources note the immense spending disparity between 1979 and 2024.
They cite cumulative defense spending over that period reaching what, $18 trillion?
18+ trillion, while infrastructure investment received only 4 to 5 trillion.
This reveals a profound priority system.
It does. The focus is overwhelmingly on imperial policy, defense spending, and projection of power abroad, while domestic well-being, our bridges, our roads, our hospitals, our schools, receives a small, often neglected fraction of the resources.
It shows that the political class prioritizes corporate and global interests over the fundamental needs of the citizenry they claim to represent.
That's the claim.
This entire system of economic extraction is maintained, the sources argue, not just by theft, but by making society itself cognitively hostile. It's a bureaucracy designed by the hyper-competent to trap the average person.
That's right. The sources argue that modern society, the legal system, the financial system, the regulatory frameworks, is designed by and for the top 16% of the population.
The people with an IQ of 115 or higher.
Yes. This group can easily navigate complexity. They understand fine print. They can advocate for themselves. The system works for them because they built it.
But what about the average citizen?
Well, since half the population, 50% has an IQ below 100, the bottom half faces systems they literally cannot navigate independently. The sources detail this cruel trap of complexity.
What are some examples?
Basic survival tasks, navigating multi-layered healthcare insurance, dealing with multi-step digital identification requirements just to renew a driver's license, filling out lengthy government benefits applications.
All of this requires a high level of reading comprehension, long-term planning, organization.
Navigating abstract logical steps. And critically, work cites that the traditional working class, those between IQ 85 and 100, struggle significantly with this modern complexity. They need substantial assistance.
And below IQ 85?
Below IQ 85, which is roughly 14% of the population, these people cannot independently navigate modern society at all. The systems are designed to maximize the friction for this entire lower half of the cognitive spectrum.
And failure to comply leads directly to collapse and criminalization.
It does. A simple mistake on a complex benefits form can lead to the loss of a license. Loss of a license leads to loss of work. Loss of work leads to homelessness or incarceration. It's a feedback loop driven by cognitive incompatibility with the system's design.
And this is where the moral confusion, which was fueled by the false narrative we talked about in part 2, it locks the trap.
It does. Society blames those who fail. It calls them lazy or says they lack personal responsibility. Why? Because the prevailing scientifically false narrative insists that anyone can succeed with hard work.
But the sources claim the reality is that a vast swath of the population lacks the raw cognitive capacity to meet the system's requirements.
A fact that is deliberately unacknowledged. Because acknowledging it would dismantle the moral justification for the complex, extractive bureaucracy. The complexity isn't an accident, it's a feature. It's a systemic barrier.
And this brings us to the final necessary pillar of the source's argument, the mechanism that sustains this entire synthesis of moral decay, cognitive suppression, and economic extraction.
And that mechanism is the comprehensive silence and betrayal of the professional class.
This is the most damning indictment presented by the sources.
It really is. That economic theft, that $4,500 to $5,000 monthly appropriation from every single worker, is based on public data from the BLS, the IRS, FRD. It is not hidden. It's right there.
Yet, the professional class maintains near total universal silence about it.
And the sources detail how every professional class, with a clear ethical duty to inform and protect the public, has failed this contractual and moral duty. They've remained silent about what the sources argue is the greatest economic injustice in history.
Let's break down the failure of duty for each group they indict.
Okay, start with the economists. They possess the data on the wage productivity gap. They know about the CPI manipulation, yet they universally refuse to inform the public about the scale of the theft.
And instead, they often defend the existing system.
Or use complexity to mask the transfer, or they blame workers for a skills gap.
Then you have the journalists, the Fourth Estate, the supposed watchdogs.
They ignore the wage theft, the inflation deception, and the tax burden transfer entirely. Instead, they distract the public with partisan theater and superficial culture wars. Their failure is one of willful omission.
What about politicians?
Across both major parties, they are structurally silent about the systematic wage theft and inflation manipulation. They serve the corporate interests that fund the suppression apparatus. They maintain a political environment where discussion of the core economic truth is forbidden.
And educators.
From high school economics teachers to university professors, they fail to teach students about this verifiable economic reality. Instead, they often substitute the other narratives, like the false racism causes poverty explanation, that distract from the true extraction mechanism. They teach conformity, not critical analysis.
It extends even to the people paid to help the poor.
Yes. Social workers blame individual dysfunction, addiction, or racism for poverty rather than the $5,000 monthly extraction. They end up expanding the bureaucratic complexity instead of demanding restitution for the people they serve.
And religious leaders, the moral authorities.
Overwhelmingly silent about the massive systematic thefts from their own congregations, they focus instead on peripheral social or identity issues.
The list continues to the legal and financial professions.
Lawyers have failed to pursue massive class action lawsuits against this documented wage theft, choosing instead to work for the very corporations perpetrating it. And accountants and financial advisors, they just tacitly accept and work within the system's manipulated CPI numbers, failing to flag the real erosion of their clients' wealth.
The sources assert that this silence is not just passive indifference, it is active deception. It's lying by omission.
They argue that if professionals with access to the data and a duty to protect the vulnerable choose universal silence, it proves one of two things. They are either complicit or they are catastrophically incompetent.
And this is the ultimate implication for you, the listener. Their credentials, the PhD, the law degree, the journalism award, they signify not integrity, but conformity to a corrupt system.
They choose silence and self-deception to avoid consequences and maintain their position within the captured institution.
This creates what the sources call a full-blown epistemic crisis.
It does. If these institutional authorities, science, media, government, religion, are silent about $54,000 being stolen annually from every working family, it reveals that their selective honesty means they serve power, not truth. Public trust collapses because their authority is proven illegitimate.
So given this total systemic capture, the sources recognize that the path to restoration has to be radical, and it starts with an uncompromising realignment with truth.
The first step is what they call a cognitive cleansing, just acknowledging the uncomfortable realities about intelligence variation, rejecting the demonstrably false poverty racism narrative, and facing the economic truth of the rigged extraction system.
There is no solution without that intellectual courage.
None. Next is the economic redesign. The sources advocate for the immediate restoration of stolen labor value through that universal dividend income of $4,500 to $5,000 monthly per adult. And that's coupled with a dramatic shift in the tax burden back onto corporations, reversing the 1979-2024 transfer.
Stevenwork also proposes the system of civic restoration, the Civic Responsibility and Community Engagement Act.
Right. This act would require 4 years of community or military service for full democratic participation.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning full voting rights, the right to hold public office, or public employment. It reestablishes the norm that the benefits of citizenship must be earned through demonstrable contribution and duty to the community.
Let's discuss John Carter's call for strategic action, which we should note sounds extreme. He advocates for right-wing council squads. How do the sources justify this measure?
Carter frames this not as vengeance, but as a surgical defensive necessity, a matter of civilizational self-preservation.
Okay.
He argues that the irredeemable individuals who actively facilitated the moral and economic decay must be removed from positions of critical trust in schools, in media, in the bureaucracy, in order to restore competence and institutional integrity. It's an acknowledgement that the captured system cannot and will not self-correct.
And he balances this, crucially, with a strong emphasis on magnanimity and forgiveness for the redeemable.
Yes, for the vast majority of people who were simply deluded or compliant due to fear, not malicious intent, the focus is on removing the architects and the active enforcers of the lie.
Ultimately, the solution requires dismantling the lie itself.
It does. Immediately defunding the grievance industry, targeting the DEI departments and consultants that monetize the false narrative, restoring merit-based hiring and promotion across all fields, and ending the criminalization of truth-telling to restore competence and integrity to all of our institutions.
The sources argue the choice is between radical truth and complete collapse.
There is no middle ground, in their view.
We have spent this deep dive synthesizing an intense and a very unified theory of societal decay. The sources argue that the citizens' journey to homo umbrans began with a foundational moral lie works forced insanity post-1973.
And that initial moral inversion weakened the mind, enabling the widespread linguistic and cognitive decay described by Carter. This cognitive vulnerability was then exploited by systematic economic extraction, the massive wage productivity gap, and the inflation deception, and perpetuated by a cognitively hostile bureaucracy.
And all of this is sustained by the complete systemic silence of the professional class who chose self-preservation over truth.
The sources suggest that timeline is terrifying. The destruction of the Republic's foundations took about 25 years. We are now 45 years into the consequences.
They suggest collapse is accelerating, with economic and civic points of no return potentially arriving in the next decade, in the 2030s.
The ultimate conclusion presented by Work and Carter is that the choice is simple, but not easy. It's restoration through uncompromising truth, which requires radical courage, or it's continued complicity, which guarantees collapse.
The professional class's silence about the $54,000 annual theft proved their institutional capture and their complete untrustworthiness.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought for you, the listener.
If the systematic silence of every professional class economists, journalists, politicians, religious leaders proves their institutional capture and untrustworthiness, the only authority that remains is objective, empirical truth itself. How do you, the individual, begin the process of rebuilding a personal, intellectual, and moral framework grounded exclusively in reality, knowing that doing so requires rejecting the foundational premises taught by almost every single institution that claim to educate, protect, and inform you?